Hello, in this video I'll show you how to make a gluten-free baguette. I start the baguette dough by blooming the yeast. To bloom the yeast, I combine 1 tablespoon of sugar with 3/4 cup of warm water. The water needs to be at 110 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature is warm enough to start the blooming process without being so hot that it kills the yeast. The blooming process ensures that the yeast is live and active. So I add in 1 packet of yeast, which is 2 1/4 teaspoon, and I let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes. If the yeast hasn't started to bloom by up to 15 minutes, then it's good to replace it and try a different yeast packet. This is the benefit of blooming the yeast, because if we made this recipe without blooming the yeast first, we might not know that the yeast isn't alive until after the dough should have risen. While the yeast is blooming, I work on my dry ingredients. I add 2 cups of flour to my mixing bowl. I'm using Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 baking mix for this, and I'm also using the spoon and level method. This method is essential anytime you're using gluten-free flour because it makes sure that you're not packing your flour in and adding more flour than the recipe would actually call for. Then I add in 3/4 teaspoon of salt. I stir these together and then I create a well in the flour using the back of a measuring cup. Then I add in 1 egg white. There's plenty of hacks on the best way to separate a yolk and an egg white, but I always just prefer bouncing the yolk back and forth between 2 halves of the shell. Then I add in 1 tablespoon of olive oil and 1 teaspoon of apple cider vinegar. The olive oil adds great flavor, and the apple cider vinegar adds additional food for the yeast without needing to put in excess sugar. As you can see by the bubbles, the yeast has bloomed nicely. So now I add it in with the other ingredients. Now I mix all of the ingredients together. I set it to stir, and once all of the ingredients have incorporated together, I'll actually take the paddle attachment off and replace it with a dough hook. This is just preference. You could start with a dough hook and mix everything with a dough hook, but I find it incorporates faster using a paddle attachment first, so I make the switch. I've sped up the video here, but I have my KitchenAid mixer set to 6. This is about medium speed. I mix the dough with the dough hook for about 3 minutes. The point of doing this is just to make sure that all of the ingredients are well incorporated and smooth. You don't have to knead gluten-free dough the same way that you would knead wheat-based dough because we don't have any gluten that we're trying to develop. So really this mixing process is just to get a smooth dough. You can see how the dough starts to come together throughout the mixing process. After the dough is done mixing, we will form it into the bread loaf shape. I don't do a bulk rise before doing a proof on the actual shaped bread loaves here because it would result in the dough over-proofing. I turn the dough out onto a piece of plastic wrap and split it in half. You could weigh the dough to make sure you get equal halves, but I normally just eyeball it. I take each half of the dough and place it into the baguette pan to form the loaf. If you don't have a baguette pan, you could also form this on a baking tray. I would recommend using parchment paper underneath the loaf. Gluten-free dough is normally much more wet and sticky than wheat-based doughs. This is because the gluten-free flour tends to absorb more moisture, so we need to make sure we have more moisture within the dough itself so that it doesn't dry out during baking. This dough should be a bit sticky to work with. I essentially pull the dough and spread it with my fingers until it reaches the length and shape that I would like. Once the dough is shaped, I use a little bit of water on my fingers to go back over the top of the dough and smooth it out. Then I loosely cover the loaves in plastic wrap and set it aside to proof. I proof the loaves at room temperature, so 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, for at least 1 hour. If you're able to proof these at a little bit higher temperature, then it should proof in less than 1 hour. The loaves are done proofing when you press into it and it leaves an indentation that does not spring back. The last 5 to 10 minutes of the proofing, I turn the oven on to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, when the loaves are done proofing, I do slight score marks using a knife. Next, I prepare a steam bath that will go into the oven with the baguettes. This is a trick to having a nice crunchy outside with a soft center. I place about 10 ice cubes onto a baking tray, and then I place the baking tray in the oven on the rack underneath where my loaves are located. I bake these for 25 minutes at 425 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very important not to open the door to the oven before the 25 minutes has passed, or the steam will let out and you won't have as crunchy of an outside. Just listen to how nice and crunchy this gluten-free baguette is. It's important to let the bread cool before cutting into it so the structure has time to set and it won't be gummy. Serve with butter or top with mozzarella and fresh bruschetta for a delicious treat. Thanks for watching this video on how to make gluten-free baguettes. Let me know how it worked out for you in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.